If you were a kid in the 90s staring out the backseat window on a motorway run, you saw them, green, white, and red. Proud names stenciled on the sun visor, gleaming paintwork that somehow looked showroom fresh even after 200 miles of haulage. You didn't need to read the company name to know it. You felt it. That was an Eddie Stobart truck. And if it was the early 90s, chances are it was sitting on top of a Volvo FL10. Ask any old school truck spotter, any former Stobart driver, or anyone who collected model trucks back then. The FL10 wasn't just a workhorse. It was the look, the vibe, the icon. Volvo's FL10 wasn't the biggest. It wasn't the flashiest, but it had this weirdly perfect mix of reliability, comfort, and British-friendly practicality that made it a perfect match for Eddie Stobart's explosive growth. Introduced in the mid-80s and built to handle a variety of urban and long-haul tasks, the FL10 was a bit of a middleweight champ. Not too tall, not too heavy, but strong where it mattered. And in the hands of Stobart, it became a legend. Why? Because of how it was used, how it was kept, and what it came to represent. The trucks were always spotless. It didn't matter if they were hauling frozen goods down the M6 or navigating tight deliveries in city centers. Stobart's FL10s were clean enough to eat off. The cabs were polished. The wheels gleamed. Drivers were expected to keep them sharp and pristine, and they did, because it wasn't just about moving freight. It was about being seen. These trucks became part of Britain's rolling scenery. Lads on school trips would count them. Dads would nudge their kids and say, "That one's called Debbie Ann." The trucks had names, for crying out loud, and the FL10s were the first wave of trucks to really bring that tradition to life in Stobart's early fleet identity. But behind all the clean paint and pride was a machine that worked hard. The FL10's 9.6-liter engine was no joke, built with Volvo's signature smoothness, but more than capable of taking on the rigors of high-mileage haulage. You weren't flying past everything on the road, but you were getting there on time, every time. And that's what Stobart needed. This was a company growing faster than most, expanding routes across the UK, handling new contracts, and needing trucks that could keep pace without falling apart. The FL10 delivered. Inside the cab, it was a different world from the rattling ERFs and old Bedfords of the previous generation. This was Volvo. Swedish design, British execution, solid build quality, decent space, and a driving position that didn't leave your back in bits after a 10-hour shift. Sure, by today's standards it's basic, but in 1992, you were living like a king. Power steering, heating that worked, a layout that didn't feel like a wartime bunker. It made the job more bearable, and the drivers respected that. But here's the secret sauce. Eddie Stobart didn't just run FL10s, they presented them. The company understood the power of branding before most hauliers did. You weren't just driving a truck, you were driving for Stobart. That came with standards, that came with image. And the FL10s were part of the brand's early DNA. They were uniformed, they were sharp. And when you lined up a row of them at a depot, it looked like a military parade. It wasn't about the horsepower, it wasn't about spec sheets. It was about how it looked and felt. And to the public, the FL10 was Eddie Stobart. TV shows picked up on it. Kids magazines featured them. You could buy a Corgi model of one and park it next to your toy garage. People started to associate the name Eddie Stobart with dependability, class, and a certain down-to-earth pride in work. That image didn't come from million-pound marketing campaigns. It came from Volvos, real trucks, real miles, real people taking care of their machines. And let's not forget, the FL10s lasted. While many of the other trucks from that period have rusted out or been turned into bean cans, you'll still see the occasional FL10 on the road today, often still in Stobart colors, owned by enthusiasts or small-time hauliers who just can't bear to part with it. They're built to go the distance. And when they're looked after like Stobart looked after them, they do go the distance. You can swap the badges, update the engine, slap on all the modern tech you want, but you can't fake character. And the Eddie Stobart FL10s had it in spades. It was the combination of Volvo's design with a British company's unmatched pride that made them more than just trucks. They became icons, symbols of a golden era when being a lorry driver meant something more than just meeting delivery windows. It meant being part of something recognizable, something respected. While the FL10 had already secured its place in the Stobart Hall of Fame, it It was the culture around the trucks that truly set them apart. These weren't just vehicles doing a job. These were rolling ambassadors, each one a proud member of a nationwide parade. And for the drivers behind the wheel, it wasn't just work, it was a way of life. Ask any Stobart driver from the 90s, and they'll tell you flat out, the pride in driving one of those FL10s was unmatched. You had to keep it spotless inside and out, not because the company told you, because the truck deserved it. Every truck had a name, and that's not just a gimmick. It made the trucks feel personal. Catherine Ann, Lucy Victoria, Jennifer Jane. They weren't license plates, they were personalities. You weren't just doing a shift, you were taking your girl on the road. That bond between truck and driver, it mattered. It meant drivers looked after the FL10s like they were their own. Cabs stayed clean, curtains stayed sharp, wheels got polished at every stop. You knew eyes were always on you. Kids counting trucks, fans keeping logs, even newspapers running features on how many miles these beauties had clocked. The FL10 also marked a time when Eddie Stobart's brand exploded beyond the industry. It wasn't just a logistics firm anymore. It was pop culture. School kids wrote essays about Stobart trucks. They had fan clubs. There were over 1 million members at one point. You could go to a Stobart convention, get your picture taken in front of a real FL10, and even meet the drivers who ran them. That doesn't happen with just any fleet. That kind of fandom is earned. And the FL10s were the workhorses that carried that reputation through Britain's motorways year after year. There were special edition trucks too, FL10s decked out for promotional events, liveried differently for seasonal campaigns, or commemorative rigs marking milestones. These weren't just painted and sent out to haul, these were celebrated. There was one in particular with a deep metallic green twist on the standard livery. Kept in perfect condition, toured around shows, and talked about like a celebrity. These FL10s weren't built to rot away in yards, they were built to be remembered. Even more than that, the FL10s became a proving ground. New drivers at Stobart often got assigned to them early on. If you looked after your FL10, you moved up the ranks. If you treated it like dirt, you didn't last long. These trucks filtered out the careless. They demanded attention to detail, and in return, they gave you a machine that started every morning, pulled every load, and made you look good doing it. You didn't need to wrestle with unreliable gearboxes or complain about electrical gremlins. It was a Volvo. It just worked. And in the snow, in the fog, in the pouring rain, when some of the fancier trucks sat waiting for repairs or couldn't cope with the weather, those FL10s kept rolling. That's why so many operators, even outside of Stobart, bought them secondhand. Once they'd finished their first life in the Stobart fleet, many of these trucks were still in such good nick, they got another decade's worth of work elsewhere. Some still run today on small farms or with independent hauliers who appreciate an old school machine that doesn't quit. You'll still find a few FL10s at shows too, fully restored, wearing original Stobart colors, with all the chrome and nostalgia turned up to 11, and when they pull in, people gather, not because it's the fastest truck or the biggest, but because it means something. It reminds them of a different time, a better time maybe, when trucks had names, and pride, and personality, when the motorway was a parade of polished metal and smiling faces, not just a blur of plastic cabs and lease hire logos. Ask any collector today what their dream Stobart truck is, and more often than not, the FL10 comes up. It's a piece of the brand's soul, the link between the company's scrappy growth years and the full-blown empire it would later become. And it captured the public's imagination in a way that few trucks ever have. Because it wasn't just what the FL10 could do, it was how it looked doing it, and who it was doing it for. That's why people remember them. That's why kids waved. Why collectors search for original parts. Why shows still feature them. The FL10 wasn't just a truck. In the Eddie Stobart fleet, it became something else entirely. A symbol of pride, polish, and power that rolled across Britain and never faded from memory.